I wanted to tell you a story before we get into our passage about, I would say a few months ago, a gal named Jen came into my office. And usually when people come to see me, there's a little bit of small talk. Hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. What's the weather like? Something like that. She had none of that. She just came in and she said, so how are Christians supposed to live their lives? It's like, okay, this is where we're going today. Good, good. And conveniently, that's exactly what we're talking about today in James. So that's perfect for us. We're kind of asking, like, how are Christians supposed to live their lives? And how does our belief in Christ affect our lives? So we're going to get into the passage in a moment, but I wanted to talk a little bit about James and his style. So the book of James, James has another name that he goes by. Does anybody know what that is? In the Greek, he's also called Jacob. If you don't know that story, so it goes that there was a translator that when translated to English changed his name to James. And then along came King James, and under his rule, this was several hundred years ago, there was people who were translating the Bible. And he really liked that a book of the Bible had the same name as him. And not only did he like that, he thought, what if a version was named after me? So that's where we get the King James Version. And James stuck from there. So we got James. James is a very direct person. He's very, he likes to call people out. His tone, he's very clear. And he's to the point. So where Paul in Romans takes so many chapters to talk about his theology, James is just going to do that in a handful of verses and then get to practice. So he's very much what we call a practical theologian. Pastor Dean gave me what is historically a very controversial passage. So we'll see what we do with that. Now, the structure of the chapter, at least the second half of the chapter, James gives 4 examples to illustrate his point. Example about basic needs, and you can follow along in your insert as well. Example about demons, an example about Abraham, an example about Rahab. And in James's mind, he makes the same point every single time. So this is sandwiched, example point, all the way through. We're only going to look at the first 2 this week, and I believe Pastor Yuji is going to take care of the second 2 the second 2 examples next week. But it's interesting, the first 2 here are outward, the first and the last are outward focused, and then the middle 2 examples are Godward focused. And so we'll get to see 2 of these, the first 2, the basic needs and the demon example. And James is kind of thinking, okay, after the first example, I'm not sure if they got my point. Let me give a second example. And then he thinks, I bet the reader still doesn't get it. So I'm going to give a third example, etc. So he gives up 4 examples to illustrate the exact same thing. All right, so let's take a look at our passage now, kind of knowing that, and knowing we're going to look at the first 2. We'll take it one example at a time. And this first one is about the basic needs of people. And this is James 2, starting at verse 14. And we're going to go through 17 and take a little pause. It says this: what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such a faith save them? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. All right, so likely, we'll take a pause there. We're going to look at the second example in a moment. But James, when he's tackling this, here he's talking about physical needs, and likely he's very literal here. He has a very literal, practical sense, not only in this chapter, but throughout his whole book. So it seems like he's actually talking about people's basic necessities, their basic needs. And it's interesting, if you look in verse 15, you'll see the words daily food. And if you look also in verse 16, you'll see the words does nothing about their physical needs. Every translator translates that slightly different. James picked very particular words there that I think are intentionally vague. And they're vague in the senses they can encompass a lot of different needs. So they could be physical needs, like food, shelter, sustenance. So when you are reading needs, think it broadly. Okay, so a lot of different physical needs could be in account there. Now, James is basically saying empty words don't really do anything. Empty words that just say things but are not connected with actions do nothing. Now, you might wonder, well, is this kind of talk about helping people's physical needs and stuff like that? Is that just James, or where else might we see that? Well, it's actually all over the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. I just picked two excerpts for us to look at. 1 John talks about physical needs as well. He says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Jesus also says in Matthew 25, what you did for the least of these brothers or sisters, you did for me. So this is a theme that's consistent throughout Scripture, but I believe the passage leaves room for this to happen both interpersonally or institutionally, meaning that James could be talking about me as a person serving or helping the needs of another person, or me as part of an organization. Say I go to a soup kitchen and that serves a whole group of people who are in need. That could also be applicable, quite applicable in these passages. So notice what's interesting here in the original passage we were looking in James. There's no qualifier for the person who's in need. So it doesn't say, well, if the person deserves it, then you should help them out. And it's quite interesting because, you know, who of us really deserves the grace of God that we've received from Him? God doesn't come up to us and say, well, if you deserve it, then I'm going to help you out. But God's love is all-encompassing, and He calls us, James is calling us through God to do the same. That if someone is in need, to go and help them and help meet those needs. Now, James then ends, as I mentioned, with his main point. And he says, in the same way, faith, if not accompanied by actions, is dead. So James is saying, meeting physical needs really is a spiritual act. And even more broadly, faith needs to be connected to actions or deeds or works. Now we're going to talk about James's main point. That's his main point that he keeps repeating over and over throughout this passage. But let's take a look at the second example that James gives us and talk about that for a little bit and see where that takes us. So this is now James 2, verse 18. Let me read this. This is James's example about demons. It says this, and he has this hypothetical argument with someone. But someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. Then James says, well, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds. You believe that there is one God. Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So, I hope you're ready. We're going to get a little bit of a demonology here, or what James is kind of teaching us through this kind of interesting example. Now, it might be strange to think of, but demons, by a matter of fact, because they're against God, have to believe some orthodox affirmations. Because if they believe God is true, they have to have something then to resist and say, I disagree with that. Now, the demons can lie, But they know, and James picks one example, one orthodox affirmation about God, that God is one. So because God is one, and the demon knows that and believes that, that's its kind of orthodox belief, the demon actually has a reaction to that too. So based on the demon's knowledge of, okay, there's God is one, the demon to its core is shaken and shudders. So at the demon's core, it's shaken. Now, what is James implying in this? Well, James is saying, you have orthodox affirmations, so does the demon. What difference are you than the demon if you have no actions? Because at least the demon has a reaction to the truth. The demon reacts and shudders. What are you doing with the truth? What are you doing with what you know about God and your faith? Are you living that out? Are you having any deeds as an expression of your faith? So James is kind of going through this extreme, very direct kind of passage and saying, what is your faith like? Now, in the next verse, which we're not going to, James kind of reaffirms his main point, and he says, faith without deeds is useless. You need to have some sort of deeds. Or in other words, I might say it like this. Faith in and of itself is a demonic and bare affirmation. Without anything else, it needs to have something. So since James has mentioned it now a few times, let's focus in on what James's main point is here that he keeps referring to. So let me just affirm and restate. We know that faith saves you. We know that works does not save you. And James is saying faith without works is dead, or without deeds is dead, and works without faith is dead. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about, when you go to the movies and you get a ticket, and then you give the ticket to the attendant and they tear it. But if you look closely, bless you, at the ticket, and I don't know if you can see this, you've probably seen it on tickets before, it says, void if detached. You know what I'm talking about? And so if you tear it before you get to the attendant, they're going to say, this doesn't count. You cannot get in and watch Black Panther. Okay? You cannot see that movie. But if you keep it together, then you give it to the attendant and you get in. Well, this is a good analogy for us. If you have faith, but it's detached from works, it's void. You cannot have just your faith. It has to come with both. So I might say it like this. Works is a natural byproduct of faith. Or works demonstrate an authentic faith. So works do not take the place of faith. You cannot have works dominate in that way. And faith cannot be earned, or you cannot perform in a way to earn that. And works cannot be used to gain favor with God. And James says, well, faith without works is dead. That means if you have a faith without any actions or deeds, it's not a faith that's sick. It's not a faith that's in the hospital. That's a faith that's in the mortuary or in the graveyard, because it needs to be accompanied by these deeds. So we kind of a little bit get this mixed up. Now you might be thinking, well, how does this work? Because didn't Paul talk about, you need to have faith and, not have works. Works were not part of our salvation. And there's this, I want to mention a little bit about this controversy sometimes people have between what James is saying and what Paul would traditionally say in Romans or other epistles. So, and notice the NIV, I'm using passages from the NIV. The NIV is kind of genius. If you read the NIV and you were looking at the passage, they like to use the word deeds or actions. And when you're reading Paul in the NIV, they tend to use the word works. Well, actually, that's the same word, But as a translator, they're hoping you don't get confused. So they want to use a different word in James, even though it's the exact same original Greek word. But so when I'm saying deeds or works or actions, I'm meaning the same thing. All right. And we have this Protestant affirmation that we got sort of derived from Paul through the Renaissance, that it's by faith alone that we're saved, by faith alone. And that's true, but what does this mean in the context of James and Paul? Well, I would say that saving faith results in a distinctive life. So it's not faith and works, but it's faith producing works. So what does your faith produce? See, there's no half faith or limited faith, but our faith is either dead or alive. It's dead and not producing anything, or it's alive and produces this lifestyle. Paul said it like this. I just picked one verse here. It says, through him we've received grace and apostleship to call all the Gentiles to, here's what I want to emphasize, the obedience that comes from faith. So that this obedience or deeds or things done that comes from an authentic faith. So works is not added to faith, but I think it's an essential expression of faith. So often in chapter 2 of James, James is often referring to charity or love if you read through the whole chapter. As far as deeds. And if you look at Paul will most often connect deeds or works with works of the law. And that's true, but theologians say, well, if you look at the whole corpus of Paul's writings and the whole corpus, the whole extent of James's writings, actually they have a wide definition of what deeds or works could be, and there's some overlap. And actually how some theologians would state it like this. Paul denies any efficacy of pre-conversion works, but James is pleading about the absolute necessity of post-conversion works. I'll say that one more time. Paul denies the efficacy of pre-conversion works, while James is pleading about the absolute necessity of post-conversion works. And so there's a flipping of the order, and I want to show you kind of a picture. Hopefully this is helpful, and if you want to draw this in your notes, in your insert, you can. If we have faith there, represented by that line in the middle of the arrow, we can have works before the faith on one side or after the faith on the other side. Paul tended to be talking about the left-hand side, faith that precedes, or works that precede faith. And James is talking about the works that are after the faith. So often you could think about this as a sequence, like what happened through time. So this is our initial conversion experience. But I believe this is something that also happens to believers who've been believers for a long time. I consider this sort of what takes precedence or priority in your life. So do your works take precedence in your life on top, over your faith? Or do your faith lead to works? What do I mean by that? Well, I think when you get the order flipped, so James is calling for works that come out of your faith. I think when you get it flipped, we often think about, well, I need to earn acceptance by doing things. And our society is kind of built on this. You have to perform to get good grades. You have to perform to get that raise or things like that. A lot of things are performance-based in our society. Or sometimes we can seek parental approval for acceptance. Or we can think, I have to act good or nice in front of others. And God actually flips it the other way. He says, no, you have faith first. You are accepted first into the family, and then your life comes out of that your life follows. And I think this is what James is trying to argue. That same gal, Jin, when she was in my office, she asked another question. Well, why don't good people, because of the good they do, why don't they go to heaven? Like, why don't they go to be with God? And I said, well, that's an interesting question. It's kind of related to what we're talking about right now. I said, can I propose, can we think about this in a slightly different way? And she said, sure. Let's think about it this way. I said, think about your parents. And she said, okay, I want to think about my dad. I said, okay, let's say you were not getting along with your dad, and you had some rift with your dad, and maybe there was some unforgiveness there, and you were not getting along, and there was just some enmity between you. What would you do to try to resolve that? And so she said, well, that's obvious. She's a very direct person. That's obvious. I would go talk to him. I would apologize for anything I did wrong. I would try to, we try to talk through the situation and explain things and see if we could work it out. I said, that's an interesting answer. I've heard that before, but it doesn't make sense to me. Let me give you another answer. What if instead of doing all that stuff that you talked about, you join the Peace Corps or an organization like that, went to a far-off country, and started working to serve those who are in need and who are at risk, and you started helping people one person at a time to change the world. Jen, what do you think of my idea? And she said, no offense, but that sounds ridiculous. Because how would that restore my relationship with my Father? And I said, Jen, you're exactly right, and that's the gospel. The gospel is about restoring relationship with the Heavenly Father, and you're not going to do that out of your good works. Good works are not going to restore that relationship. So you're trying to mix two things that don't intersect. Christianity is about our faith first, and then out of that relationship with the Father, our deeds and our actions flow out of that. Because sometimes in society, or I think in our own lives, we flip the order. And there's kind of two, I'll say, quote, gospels. Satan, or the world's gospel, says you're saved by your own works. The problem is you can't ever attain acceptance. You won't ever get there because it's impossible to manage our own sin. It's impossible to work out our own actions. God says the reverse. We're saved by the works of Christ. And by trusting in that, we come to be saved and know God, and then our actions can flow out of that because of what Christ has already done for us. It's something that we can't earn. Now, the problem with, I think, how this seeps into our lives is as Christians, we might see something like James and we'll say, okay, well, I'm going to try to be a good person, or I'm going to try to be a nice Christian and just live that out. We might not think that consciously, but unconsciously, we try to live out this nice life as a Christian. But I think there's a problem when we just try to be nice, so we just try to be good. I think that's not what James is talking about. Just think about some of our heroes in the New Testament. For example, Paul. Would you say, hey, Paul, he's a super nice person? I don't know. Paul's a little rough around the edges sometimes. He says some edgy things. Think about Peter. Was Peter a nice person? No, he was just shooting his mouth off all the time and just saying all sorts of things. Or even think about Jesus. Was Jesus a nice person? Well, maybe. But then I think about that one day Jesus went into the temple and then went home and thought, I'm going to come back the next day and whip people. So I'm going to make my whip. The scripture talks, he makes his whip. And thinking, I'm not only going to whip people, I'm going to turn some tables over. Okay, I'm going to do that tomorrow. And then he goes back and he does that. Or he calls people out. He calls people hypocrites or brood of vipers. Who are the nice people? I think the nice people are in James 2:16, when it says, if one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and be well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs. I don't think that James or Christ is calling us necessarily to be a nice person. In philosophy, we call that secular humanism, which means that you are trying to obtain, you can obtain as a human ethical standards and good morals through, your own means instead of via God. And we're not called to that. We're not called to some secular humanism or anything like that. We're called to be fully transformed by the gospel. To transform, to live a radical life through the gospel and not to be conformed to a regular, nice person that we might meet on the street. If we go back to Jin for a second, this is what she really took issue with. So she had some friends that she knew, and she just didn't understand her friends who were Christians, because she said, I can understand how someone from another area of the world, and she picked the Middle East, I can understand how they're Christians, because they undergo a lot of suffering, and they really have to choose, like, this is my faith, I'm going to believe in it, and I'm going to live it out. But she said, people I know in America, they're just Christians by default, because they just say they're Christians, but she said, their life looks like mine. I can't tell the difference between the Christians I know and my own life. So that's why she asked originally, what does it mean to be a Christian? I don't want to be a Christian by default. And she was really disturbed by this, and this is what was keeping her from the faith. See, I believe we need to stand out as Christians and be completely countercultural. This is the sort of actions and deeds or works that James was talking about. Not being a Christian by default. When I was graduating and finishing my doctorate, all my friends, and what was normal was to go into industry. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go into industry because that's great. I can make a six-figure salary. That can make me happy, and that'll be great. And I had these ideas from my life. And then a minister approached me and said, well, have you ever considered, ministry or kind of serving God? I said, sort of, well, really, not at all. And challenged me into ministry. And I thought, okay, what if I put off going to industry for a year and take this step of, volunteering in ministry for a year and see how that goes. And my, what's called a PI, or principal investigator, that was my faculty advisor, thought that was insane that I wasn't going to industry, because that's what he was all about. He was sending people into academia or industry and things like that. And he had graduated many doctoral candidates who ended up getting their PhD and such things. So, but I don't know, I just decided to do that. And then I thought, a series of events just happened to me and that I chose into that I didn't predict. I thought, well, I need to get a part-time job if I'm in ministry. I wonder if I should start teaching. I think I can teach chemistry at the university. That would be a great part-time job. And I never thought I would be a teacher, but I ended up teaching and enjoying it and realizing, wow, I have a huge ministry field. Because my classes have 400 to 500 students, and they're just huge. And I realized this is a big ministry field which I could serve in. And I started making these really decisions that were insane to other people and it just looked strange. But there was these small steps. And then I came across somebody suggested, hey, why don't you give some teaching or seminar on God versus science? And I thought, does anybody even think about that topic? I don't know. I don't think it's a big deal. But I prepared this seminar, and it turned out just to resonate with people. And just through the years, God has brought me places that I never expected to go through making decisions for Him that were a bit countercultural. And my challenge is to you, how is God radically transforming your life so that you're not just being like a good, nice person in that sense as anybody else in the world would be, but the kind of person that James is calling us out to. You know, James in his first example said, hey, don't just say, you know, oh, be warm, be good, I'll pray for you, stay there. But he said, why don't you go serve people who are in need? You know, that's pretty countercultural. He's taking actually the whole chapter, what you heard last week about favoritism, last time he talked about James, and this time he's saying, let's be totally countercultural and serve those who are in need. Pastor Dean was telling me a story about somebody in this congregation who befriended somebody who works at a local bakery and ended up getting some of the food there that was not going to be used and using it to feed some people who were in need and who are shut-ins that locally some of the brothers and sisters here. And that was just a way that this person was able to serve God in a really unusual way and live out their faith. So I kind of come back to, what are we doing? You know, what are we doing with our faith? Some of you may be thinking, should I just do more than I've been doing right now? And you know, I don't think it's about the quantity of what you're doing, but it's really the content and the quality of how you live out your faith. It's about kind of seeking God and thinking, how can I take personal risks in my faith? Is my faith alive or is my faith dead, James might say? Is your faith being lived out in a real practical way, or is it just sidelined and a part of my life that I'm not doing very much with? I kind of express it in this way. How can our lives express our faith? Remembering that your deeds don't earn you faith. Your deeds don't earn favor with Christ. Christ already did all that for us. He has already extended grace to us. It's not about that. It's about, how am I going to follow Christ's example? How am I going to live out this faith that I already have? And because of what Christ did for me, I want to be totally transformed within our culture. You know, unfortunately, by a lot of Christians, the bar has been set really low. And people come in, people look at Christians, and in our society, sometimes don't think very highly of them. So I'd encourage you to take cue from James and what James is encouraging us to do. Maybe you want to be someone who meets people's physical needs. That would be a great way to apply this what we're reading about in James. Maybe, and I want to encourage you, I want to invite the worship team back up. I want to encourage you as we're having our end time of worship and prayer and things like that, to pray and think about what are some ideas, what's some wisdom that God could give you in your workplace, at school, wherever you might be, to live out your faith in a radical way. Not to be conformed by what you see other people doing, but to live out your faith in a way as Jesus might. So may God, I pray that as we worship, God might give you ideas and wisdom about how that could happen, whether it's meeting physical needs, living your life out in a particular way, that God may inspire us and give us new life.